I'm Sasha. I'm super nervous to be up here, but slowly the relief is kicking in. I'm seeing a bunch of friendly faces out there, so the nerves are going. But today I'm going to give a presentation about one of the regions in our game, the Knightling, and I'm just going to show how we made it. So, about me, I am a graduate from Breda University with a degree in game design, I guess. And I'm currently a game designer at Twirlbound, focused on level design and world building. And I've worked on the Knightling now for 4 years. So to give a little bit of context, because I've been talking about the Knightling a lot, what is the Knightling? I'm going to play you a little trailer. Thank you. We're super proud of the game. So as we saw, the Knightling is an open-world action-adventure game where you play as a knight in training with this multi-purpose shield that you use for everything, for sliding, your movement, and for combat. And it's also the second game made by Twirlbound, and we're a small indie studio of 15 people, so it's quite an ambitious project. And I'll be going over how we made the open world for such a small team. So the Outskirts is one of 4 regions in the Knightling, and it is the starting region focused on onboarding the player, tutorialization, and basically getting them familiar with the core game loop. And it also establishes the story of the world and the player narrative. So in today's presentation, at least the order that we will approach this, is that I will first go into pre-production. What did the region look like on paper? Asking questions like, what does it look like? What does the region have to say? And what does the player do in the region? Before moving on to production, where I will be going through 3 phases of iterations that we did, with what our goals were for each phase, the approach that we took to realize those goals, and the improvements to be made at each phase. So, to begin, one of the first questions was, what does this region look like? And we approached that by trying to find its place in the world. So we gathered a bunch of photo references, created mood boards, and created concept art. And we did that for each region before trying to find their relationship with one another and placing them down in a map, so like some sort of first draft. And by doing this, we learned a few things. 1, it's the first of 4 regions. I don't know if I've said that enough already, but and it's along the southern coastal. I don't know if I'm keep moving away from the microphone, but it's along the southern coast, and it's farming focused, and that we can see that with our concept art. There's a lot of fields present. There's a lot of aqueducts. And then we did an iteration of our map. We tried to build it out in the engine with terrain, and then took a top-down and did more sketching on top of it. And while we did this, we noticed a few more things pop up. Like we would have a city connecting to the other regions, kind of like this hub point. And we would have 5 sub-regions for the Outskirts. The next question we had was, what does this region have to say? To do that, we tried to collect all of our stories that we concepted for the game, those being the main story, the world story, and the regional stories. So without getting too much into spoilers, I'll try to give a little debrief of what the main story looks like. There is a knight called Sir Lionstone, which is highly revered by the people in this world for having defeated a giant. And you are his knight in training. And you are tasked with investigating a giant sighting before you get separated. You then, as the Knightling, go on an adventure to try to reunite with Sir Lionstone with nothing but his shield left behind, the multi-purpose shield that I mentioned earlier. Then we were trying to gather what our world stories. We kind of picked these from our main stories. There's some themes that we see from the main story, and that being that giants inhabited the land before the humans arrived. We have a social hierarchy within the humans of high and low classes. We have the queen at the top there and a farmer at the bottom. And that knights are important because of this potential threat of the giants returning. And at the very bottom, we have bandits who don't want to align with this social hierarchy, and they are the main enemy of the game that you will encounter. Finally, we tried to figure out what our regional story was, and to get there, we basically took our map and tried to place the stories we already had on top of it. So for example, these high and low class stories that I was mentioning, we had that be done through our city and the surrounding regions. So the city being the high class area and the surrounding regions being the low class. But then we still have a very large space still to work with. Which is where we started trying to breaking it down, a dye farm, a farm for cloth, and a farm for food. This was very important to do because in our vertical slice, we noticed a few things or a few themes start showing up with our assets, and that is that we had a lot of colorful environmental architecture, and we also had a lot of cloth present. So having a space where we could kind of tell that story of how are they producing this, where are they getting these resources from, not only shows like, okay, this is how they get access to that, but also what's the humans' value, that being dye and cloth, and of course, food. Everyone loves food. The next question we had was, what does the player do in the region? And to do that, we tried to imagine what our content would be through quests, features, and activities. For quests, we knew that we would have a tutorialization moment, and we tried to showcase that to the player by having them help Sir Lionstone with the giant sighting. And this kind of gave a safe space for the player to practice their character controls. After separating from Sir Lionstone, you are tasked with reporting back to the Queen, which is where you now have access to his shield, and we tutorialize the shield mechanics, before finally we open it up to the player with the task of proving yourself as a knight by helping people. And this is where the player really starts interacting with the content that will be seen through the rest of the game. And before you can move on to the next region, we check, does the player understand the core loop? We need to make sure that that is clear before they move on to the next section. And we do that by having the player upgrade the shield to move on and continue their search for Sir Lionstone. There was a few features that we knew we would have going into this region, even though we didn't have a full idea of what all of those would be, but we did know we would have movement. Our game is very movement heavy, so we would have sliding and sprinting. We also knew that we would have combat encounters and a glider, or upgrades, glider being one of them, this being the upgrade that you need to get to the next region, and puzzle elements. But it was very important for me as a level designer to kind of determine what would be the most used feature of the region, and trying to hone the region in on that feature. And we noticed very early that it would be sliding. You use that to get to the combat encounter, to the next quest. So this was the most prominent feature. And then finally, the activities. This was an interesting portion during pre-production because we didn't yet have any real prototypes of of what these activities would look like. But from all the information we had so far, we knew that we would need to have places in the world where the player could pick up quests, so human villages or settlements. And we also knew we would have bandit camps where the player could encounter combat, and us being a heavy movement game, races, obviously. Then we had planned for some puzzle elements with the skin of our giants to kind of try to bring their story into the world through these activities. It was a good point to kind of mesh those two. And I wanted to showcase, I wanted to showcase some content that we had planned, but we got rid of throughout development. So we had, for example, a whole bunch of puzzles planned to fill out the regions, to fill the region out with. And I noticed I completely skipped the random encounters. The random encounters was what we did to kind of fill in, if I go back a few, what we did to fill in these empty pockets that we notice. And we knew that we would have random encounters for smaller quests or smaller combat encounters just scattered throughout the world. All right, for me, the most exciting part of this presentation is the production. So for our first phase of iterations, I wanted to start by showing our very first iteration, which is this. It's very basic, mostly trees and a few interesting blocks. But I wanted to show it because very early on, just from this first iteration, we knew that this massive landmark that we had planned, the aqueduct, wasn't really supporting sliding, which was the feature that we would use the most, as much as it could. The shape didn't really encourage it, unlike the curved aqueduct. So that was one of the first things we fixed with the next iterations. But our goals for this phase was to determine scale, guidance, and our world story. And we did that through placing down our terrain shapes, placing down our landmarks, like the aqueduct that I mentioned, and the large landmark that we see at the end of the peninsula, that being a ruined structure from these giants, and our large shapes, which are all the white cubes. And our noted improvements at this point was that the world stories of the giants and the bandits aren't as present as we would like them to be, despite having one of our landmarks represent the giants. Throughout the rest of the region, it's not that prominent. So to resolve this problem, we took underdeveloped portions of the region, and we tried to place down ruined architecture of these giants to help represents their story, to show that they have inhabited these lands before. But from our map of the activities earlier, we also knew we had bandit camps planned in this location. And it was kind of a killing two birds with one stone moment, where they are sitting at the bottom of the barrel, these bandits, and they don't want to associate with the social hierarchy. But giants are also very feared by the humans, so them occupying this space started making a lot of sense, and we feel like these camps specifically really came together. During this phase, we also knew that we would need to have 4 modular kits to kind of represent the world stories that I mentioned earlier, one of that being the giant architecture, different kits for low and high class, and scaffolding that we would use primarily for the bandits. For the next phase of iterations, we were focused on trying to determine the movement, the flow and pace, and the main story. And we did this by replacing our large structures with the new architectural kits that I was talking about, and placing our world ingredients. Basically, those are the mushrooms that we see scattered around. They help you with your jump, or they give you a speed boost when you're sliding over them, and by placing our quests. And the placement of our quests was quite interesting at this point, because we knew quite early on that we weren't going to dive into gameplay very quickly. We wanted to make sure that we focused on the world first and the stories and had that represented before moving into gameplay. So for quests, we had mostly go-tos, interacting with NPCs that would tell you to go to the next one. But we also tried to represent our content by placing these massive cylinders in the world to showcase where these combat encounters and puzzles would happen along the path in your quest. And improvements at this point was that the main story was running too long, which was kind of interesting, because like I mentioned, we didn't really place our content down. We just had go-tos. But even then, our main story was running too long. And we tried to solve this in a lot of different ways. We looked at whether or not the next go-to point for the quest was clear enough. And we tried to resolve that through paintovers, making it really clear the next destination. We also tried to make sure that the path in between the quest steps was movement heavy and that you could get there quickly. We thought that would resolve the problem. But our end-all solution was actually looking at the quests themselves, and we noticed that it was quite linear, and we were asking the player to interact with this quest, then that quest, before they can progress to the next region. And we solved that by basically opening those quests up. The player could approach them however which way they wanted to, and we would just check how many quests has the player completed before moving on to the next region. And this also really supported the story of feeling like a knight. You now got to choose to help people rather than be forced to help people. So it was, again, another two birds with one stone moment. And the other improvement point we noticed at this phase was that the player isn't upgrading as much as we would like them to. Hello? So we had two places where the player, two upgrade points where the player could upgrade their shield. But they were kind of out of the way from the sub-regions that I was talking about earlier, which is where a lot of these quests are taking place. So we noticed that players weren't moving towards them. And an obvious solution to this was to place the upgrade points within the sub-regions themselves. And that helped a lot, but it also helped strengthen the believability of the sub-region. That was something that we noticed with this minor change that I wanted to mention. And finally, the last phase of iterations that we did was to focus on finally implementing that gameplay that we talked about earlier and developing the regional story. To do that, we placed our settlements, we finally got into our set dressing, and working on our content. Now, this sounds really scary. It was also really scary for us to wait until this phase to finally get it in. But because we're a small team, in the previous phases, we are looking at expanding our features, experimenting with them, trying to find interesting combinations. But at this point is when we started trying to actually determine what that content would look like. And to do this, we were looking at places in the world that seemed to be a good location. We had the cylinders as a general direction. But once the world is out there, you start noticing these really interesting places start forming. So for example, our fields really looked maze-like, so we could start introducing our features there to create this type of content, for example. And our improvements at this phase was that there was a lack of reason to return to the region once you moved to the rest of the world. And to do that, or to resolve that problem, we looked at the upgrades the player is mostly interacting with in the upcoming regions. And we tried to, again, think of content, small pockets that we could include in the region to cater to that. So, for example, the next region, you get access to the glider. So doing overpaints, trying to think of what different types of content, including the glider in this region could look like, and then placing it in worked very well. And pushing sliding further was our last point of improvement at this phase. And it's interesting because we did notice that a lot of the architecture and a lot of the large shapes really supported encouraging the player to slide. But the world ingredients that I mentioned earlier started becoming a bit of a pain point. Because when you look at them and you hear about them, it sounds all good. It makes you go fast. But it doesn't really give you a sense of direction when you look at it initially. So there was a lot of times where sliding was interrupted, you crash into rocks, and now the experience is kind of ruined. And to resolve this, we tried to replace that world ingredient with something that had a little bit more shape to it to kind of showcase the player how they should approach it with sliding, and less interruptions started happening as a result of this. So the takeaways was that a fleshed out plan led to a fleshed out world. Answering these questions early on and making these considerations, you really start to notice them come through in the world. We had an idea of it earlier, and at each iteration, basically checking to make sure that our world stories, our activities are popping up. Paper iterations gave strong communication and saved a lot of time. I showed a few paper iterations that we did with the overpaints throughout the presentation. And it takes a lot of time to iterate in engine and to get an idea of what you want your content to look like. So having that vision down on paper first not only saves time, but also you can show it to environmental artists and be like, hey, does this make sense? Like, could you see where I'm trying to take it? And then world building first and embedding content later made it feel grounded. So that whole scary moment of saving gameplay for the very end actually worked in our favor, because the world feels like how to explain it? Instead of building the world around the content feels like it's believable in the space and not, yeah. And then building for the most used feature made the region feel satisfying. So very early on, knowing that the sliding would be the most used feature throughout, and making sure that that was reflected through our landmark, like the aqueduct or our architecture and these large shapes. And then finally, the world ingredients really made this feature feel satisfying. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. There was so much more I wanted to get into that I couldn't. So please reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to share all of the things that I excluded. And also, if you haven't played the Knightling, you can play it here on the showcase floor, or the demo is still available on Steam. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I'm afraid we don't really have much time for extensive questioning, but I do have a question I want to ask you myself. So you very deliberately chose to tackle the outskirts in your session. What made that particular region special to you? Is there anything that you did differently?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, I really wanted to have access to the outskirts because I feel like working on it also helped me learn about the game while I was making it, since you're tutorializing it for players, but you're also kind of tutorializing how everything works to yourself. So for that region, I really enjoyed it. And it was, I don't know, out of all of our regions, the most colorful and the most friendly, so that had a lot of appeal to me as well. Yeah.
Exciting. All right. Thank you also. Thank you for your session, and thank you all for listening.